Wyoming Territory, 1873. The wind was the only constant companion Ethan Kane had ever trusted. It was a merciless thing, a sculptor of stone and a thief of warmth, but it never lied. It swept down from the jagged peaks of the Bighorn Mountains, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of an early snow, and scoured the valley where his ranch sat like a solitary ship on a brown, silent sea. From his porch, he watched the dust devils dance across the plains, golden phantoms in the late afternoon sun. They were restless, just like the memories that churned inside him, and just as empty. Ethan had built his world on a foundation of solitude. The ranch was his fortress, its fences the lines he had drawn not just against the wilderness, but against the world of men. He had bought the land 5 years prior, after the war, after everything. He'd come here to forget, or at least to bury the past so deep the frost could never reach it. The work was his absolution. Mending fences, tending his small herd of cattle, chopping wood until his shoulders screamed in protest. Each task was a prayer against the stillness, a bulwark against the quiet moments when the faces came back to him. Sarah, with her laugh that sounded like wind chimes. Jacob, his son, with a grip so small and yet so strong on his finger. The fever had taken them in a matter of days, a silent, invisible marauder more brutal than any bullet he had faced at Shiloh. After that, attachment had become a poison, a vulnerability he could not afford. A man survived alone. That was the code. It was a bitter creed, but it was all he had left. His housekeeper, Martha, a sturdy widow whose silence was as comfortable as his own, moved about inside the small ranch house. He could hear the faint clink of pottery as she prepared their evening meal. She was a presence, not an intrusion, a part of the landscape like the cottonwoods that grew along the creek. She understood the boundaries. She never asked about the past, never pried into the locked room of his heart. For that, he was grateful. Her presence kept the crushing weight of absolute loneliness at bay, allowing him to maintain the illusion of connection without the risk of its pain. He leaned against a post, the rough-hewn wood familiar against his back. His gaze swept the horizon, a habit born of years spent watching for threats, for changes in the weather, for anything that might disrupt the fragile peace he had constructed. The sky was a vast, unforgiving canvas of pale blue, bleeding into shades of orange and rose at the western edge. And there, against the muted tapestry of dust and scrub, was a flicker, a sliver of color that did not belong. It was not the dun hide of a deer or the gray of a coyote. It was a patch of deep blue, unnervingly still. He straightened, his body tensing. Animals moved. The wind moved everything else. Stillness like that in the open was the province of the dead or the dying. He squinted, his eyes sharp from a lifetime of scanning distances. It was miles out, too far to be certain, but the wrongness of it settled in his gut like a cold stone. He could ignore it. It was not his business. The wild was filled with tragedies that had nothing to do with him. He had his work, his fences, his walls. But the image of that small, unmoving patch of blue snagged in his mind. It was a loose thread in the tightly woven fabric of his isolation. With a low sigh that was half curse, he pushed himself off the post. The code of solitude was a simple one, but it had an unwritten clause, one inherited from his father and the generations before him. You did not leave a soul to the mercy of the wilderness if you could help it. It was a matter of basic humanity, a debt paid to the harsh land that allowed him to exist upon it. He walked to the corral, his long strides eating up the ground. His horse, Apollo, a powerful buckskin, nickered softly as he approached. As he saddled the gelding, the wind picked up, whispering through the dry grass. It sounded like a warning, or perhaps a premonition. He did not know which was worse. He swung into the saddle, the familiar creak of leather a small comfort, and turned Apollo toward the strange blot of color marring the perfect, desolate landscape. He was riding toward a disruption, and every instinct he had honed for survival screamed at him to turn back. But he kept riding. The journey stretched the afternoon thin, the sun sinking lower and casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to clutch at Apollo's hooves. The air grew cooler, the scent of sage and dust growing sharp. As Ethan drew closer, the shape resolved itself. It was a person, a woman, judging by the shape of the dress, which was the source of that unnatural blue. She was lying beside a cluster of sagebrush, half-curled as if trying to find shelter from the vast emptiness around her. There was no horse, no wagon, no sign of how she had come to be in this desolate place. She was simply there, a piece of story he could not read. He dismounted a dozen yards away, the silence broken only by the jingle of his spurs and the soft thud of his boots on the hard-packed earth. He approached with the caution of a man confronting a cornered animal. Her hair, the color of spun honey, was matted with dust and tangled with bits of weed. One side of her face was pressed into the dirt, her skin frighteningly pale beneath a film of grime. Her dress, though made of fine material, was torn at the hem and stained with travel. Her hands were raw, her knuckles scraped bloody, as if she had been crawling. A discarded bonnet lay a few feet away, its silk ribbon fluttering like a trapped bird. Kneeling beside her, he reached out a hesitant hand, touching her neck to search for a pulse. Her skin was cold, frighteningly so, but beneath his fingers he felt it, a faint, thready beat as fragile as a moth's wing. She was alive. A wave of something unwelcome and potent washed over him. Responsibility. This was no longer an object on the horizon. This was a life, and it was now, inexplicably, in his hands. Her lips were cracked and blue, and a low, rattling sound came from her chest with each shallow breath. Dehydration, exposure. She wouldn't last until morning. With a grim sense of finality, he gathered her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, almost nothing at all. As he lifted her, her head lolled back against his shoulder, and a faint scent of lavender, almost completely buried under the dust and sweat, reached him. It was a scent from another world, a world of polished rooms and civilized grace, a world he had long since abandoned. The unexpected intimacy of her weight against him, the feel of her soft hair brushing his jaw, sent a jolt through his system. It was a foreign sensation, this contact with another person, and it cracked a fissure in the icy wall around his heart. For a moment, he was frozen, holding this stranger who felt both impossibly fragile and immensely heavy. He shook himself free of the paralysis. There was no time for contemplation. He carried her to Apollo, who shifted nervously, his ears twitching at the unfamiliar scent of the woman. "Easy, boy," Ethan murmured, his voice a low rumble. Arranging her across the front of his saddle was an awkward, clumsy process. He tried to be gentle, but he was a man accustomed to the brute force of ranch work, not the delicate handling of a half-dead woman. He settled her as best he could, her head resting against his chest, and mounted behind her. He wrapped one arm securely around her waist, pulling her close to shield her from the wind and share what little warmth his body offered. The ride back was a study in tension. Every jolt of the horse, every gust of wind, seemed to threaten the fragile life he held. He was acutely aware of every detail, the way her slight form moved with the rhythm of the horse, the rasp of her breathing near his ear, the cold that seemed to radiate from her bones. He urged Apollo into a steady, ground-eating trot, his eyes fixed on the distant, welcoming light that he knew would be shining in the window of his home. Martha always lit a lamp at dusk. Tonight, that small point of yellow in the vast, encroaching darkness was not just a landmark. It was a beacon of hope. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, plunging the world into a deep, velvety purple. The fortress of his solitude had been breached, not by an army, but by a single, unconscious woman who smelled faintly of lavender. As the familiar shapes of the barn and corral emerged from the gloom, he shouted, his voice raw from the dry air. "Martha!" The name was torn from his throat, a sound of urgency he had not uttered in years. The front door of the ranch house flew open, spilling a rectangle of warm light onto the dusty ground. Martha stood silhouetted in the doorway, her stout frame rigid with alarm. "Ethan? What is it?" she called out, her voice sharp with concern. He didn't answer until Apollo had come to a stop, and he was carefully dismounting, cradling the woman in his arms. He carried her into the light, and Martha's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. "Lord have mercy," she breathed. "Is she alive?" "Barely," Ethan said, his tone clipped and strained. He brushed past her into the warmth of the house. "Get the bed in the spare room ready. We need blankets, water." The house, which had always felt spacious enough for his emptiness, now seemed small and crowded with the sudden, overwhelming presence of this crisis. He carried her down the short hallway to the guest room, a room that had remained unused and immaculate for 5 years, a silent monument to a future that had never arrived. He laid her gently on the patchwork quilt, her limp form a stark contrast to the room's clean, ordered stillness. For the second time that day, he felt a profound sense of trespass, as if he had brought the chaos of the outside world into the one place he had deemed safe. Martha bustled in behind him, her shock replaced by a brisk, no-nonsense efficiency. Together, in the quiet lamplight, they set about the task of coaxing a life back from the edge of the abyss. Clara awoke to the scent of lemon soap and drying pine. A thick, unfamiliar weight rested on her, and for a terrifying moment, she thought she was buried. She struggled, a weak sound escaping her throat, and the weight shifted. It was a quilt, heavy and warm. Her eyes fluttered open, struggling to focus. She was not in the desert. She was in a bed, in a room. The walls were whitewashed, clean and bare except for a simple wooden cross. Sunlight, soft and muted, filtered through a lace curtain covering a small window. A gentle fire crackled in a small stone hearth across the room, casting a warm, dancing glow on the wooden floor. This was a place of safety, of quiet, and she had no idea how she had gotten here. Memory returned in fractured shards. The jolting wagon ride from the train depot. The dusty, false promise of the town of prosperity. The smirking man, Mr. Blackwood, who had taken her last dollar for a deed to a worthless patch of rock and dust. The dawning, sickening realization that she was utterly alone, deceived and abandoned thousands of miles from the only home she had ever known. Then, the desperate, foolish decision to walk to the next town, a place marked on her map as Redemption Creek. The sun had been a merciless hammer, the landscape an endless, repeating panorama of brown and gray. She remembered the thirst, a fire in her throat. She remembered falling. After that, there was only a hazy dream of being lifted, of the rhythmic sway of a horse, and the solid, steady beat of a heart against her ear. The door creaked open, and a woman entered, carrying a tray. She was middle-aged, with kind, weary eyes and hands that looked both strong and gentle. Her graying hair was pulled back in a severe bun, but a few stray wisps had escaped to soften her face. She stopped when she saw Clara's open eyes, and a small, relieved smile touched her lips. "Well now, look who's decided to rejoin the living." Her voice was low and calm, like stone smoothed by a river. Where am I?" Clara's voice was a dry, raspy whisper. Her throat felt like it was lined with sandpaper. "You're at the Kane Ranch," the woman said, setting the tray on a small table beside the bed. "My name is Martha, and you, young lady, gave us quite a scare." She poured water from a pitcher into a glass and helped Clara sit up, propping pillows behind her back. The simple act of sitting felt like a monumental effort. Clara drank the water greedily, the cool liquid a balm to her parched throat. "Easy now," Martha cautioned. "Small sips." "How did I get here?" Clara asked, her mind struggling to connect the pieces. "Mr. Kane found you, out on the plains." Another few hours. Martha let the sentence hang in the air, her meaning clear. "He brought you here. That was 2 days ago, 2 days." She had lost 2 whole days. She looked down at herself. She was wearing a simple, clean nightgown, not her own. Her torn blue dress was nowhere in sight. A blush crept up her neck. I washed you and changed you," Martha said, seeming to read her mind. "Your dress is being mended. You had a fever, but it broke last night. You're weak, but you'll mend." Clara sank back against the pillows, overwhelmed. A man, a stranger named Kane, had found her, touched her, brought her to his home. I must thank him, she said, her voice still weak. Martha's expression became guarded. You'll have your chance. He's not a man for a lot of fuss. For now, you just rest. I've brought you some broth for the next few days. This became their routine. Martha was her gentle, watchful guardian, coaxing her to eat, helping her take a few wobbly steps around the room, speaking in a calm, soothing cadence that slowly knitted Clara's frayed nerves back together. Of Mr. Kane, she saw nothing, but she heard him. She learned the rhythm of his life through the sounds that penetrated the walls of her room. The heavy tread of his boots on the porch before dawn, the distant ring of a hammer on an anvil, the low, steady murmur of his voice as he spoke to his horse. He was a ghost, a presence defined by his absence, and he intrigued her more than he intimidated her. He had saved her life, yet he remained completely hidden from it. A week after she had woken, Clara felt strong enough to leave her room for more than a few minutes. Dressed in her mended blue dress, which now seemed a relic from another lifetime, she made her way into the main room of the house. It was a single large space, dominated by a massive stone fireplace. A long wooden table with 2 benches stood in the center. The furniture was sparse, handmade, and functional. There were no decorations, no paintings, no personal touches, save for a shelf of well-worn books. It was the home of a man who needed shelter, not comfort. He was there, sitting at the table, cleaning a rifle. He looked up as she entered, and for the first time, she saw him clearly. He was younger than she had imagined, perhaps not yet 30. His hair was dark as a raven's wing, and his eyes were a startling pale gray, the color of a winter sky. They were eyes that seemed to have seen too much. A dark stubble shadowed a strong jaw, and his face was all hard angles and grim lines, as if carved from the unforgiving landscape outside. He was not handsome in the way of the men she had known in Boston, with their soft hands and tailored suits. His was a raw, powerful presence, intimidating and compelling in equal measure. He acknowledged her with a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Miss," he said, his voice a low baritone that sent a shiver down her spine. "Mr. Kane," she replied, her own voice sounding small and thin in the quiet room. She clasped her hands in front of her to still their trembling. I wanted to thank you. You saved my life." He finished wiping down the barrel of the rifle before answering, his focus absolute. Anyone would have done the same. He set the cloth aside and began to reassemble the weapon with an economy of motion that was mesmerizing to watch. His hands were large and calloused, yet they moved with a practiced, certain grace. "Perhaps," she said softly, "but it was you who did. I am in your debt." He looked at her then, a direct, penetrating gaze that made her feel as if he were seeing right through her, to the foolish hopes and desperate fears she carried inside. "There's no debt. You rest, you get your strength back. Martha will see you have what you need." His tone was not unkind, but it was dismissive. It was the tone of a man closing a door, and it was clear the subject was closed. He returned his attention to his rifle, the faint clicks of metal on metal filling the silence. The audience was over. Dinner that evening was a tense, quiet affair. Clara sat at the long table with Ethan and Martha. The food was simple, stew and fresh bread, but delicious. The silence, however, was a palpable thing. Martha tried to fill it with small talk about the chickens and the garden, but the conversation faltered under the weight of Ethan's stoicism. He ate without speaking, his focus on his plate. Clara, determined not to be cowed, tried to engage him. "Your ranch is very isolated, Mr. Kane," she began. "That's the point," he answered without looking up. "Is the town Redemption Creek far from here?" "A day's ride." Each of his answers was a stone wall. She felt a flicker of frustration. This man had held her life in his hands, had carried her, sheltered her. She was living in his house, wearing clothes his housekeeper had provided, eating his food. Yet he was a complete stranger, more distant than any man she had ever met. She wanted to understand him, to see past the granite exterior to the man who had stopped for a scrap of blue in the wilderness. Later that night, unable to sleep, she wandered back into the main room. The fire had been banked, casting long, dancing shadows. He was there, sitting in a worn leather chair before the hearth, staring into the glowing embers. He held a small, carved wooden bird in his hands, turning it over and over. He didn't seem to notice her at first, his attention so completely absorbed by the flames and the object in his hands that the world around him had ceased to exist. In that unguarded moment, the harsh lines of his face seemed to soften, and the look in his eyes was not cold, but filled with a profound, bottomless grief. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to disturb you," she said softly. He started, his hand closing around the small bird, concealing it. The mask of indifference slammed back into place. "Couldn't sleep. My mind is restless," she admitted, moving to stand near the opposite side of the fireplace. The warmth felt good. "I keep replaying my own foolishness." "It wasn't foolish to hope for a better life," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. The statement was so at odds with his gruff demeanor that it startled her. Encouraged, she took a hesitant breath and began to speak. She told him everything, the words spilling out in a quiet torrent. She told him about her parents' death from influenza in Boston, about her lonely life as a poorly paid governess, about the small inheritance that had dwindled to almost nothing. She told him about the advertisement in the newspaper, a glowing description of the new town of Prosperity, Wyoming, a place for decent, hard-working people to build a new life. She had written to the land agent, Mr. Silas Blackwood, who had painted a picture of a burgeoning community with a school in need of a teacher. The small plot of land was a bonus for signing a 2-year contract. It had seemed like a sign, a chance to build something of her own. "He was so charming in his letters," she said, her voice laced with the bitterness of betrayal. "He met me at the depot. He was a gentleman. He took my final payment and gave me the deed and a map. He said he had urgent business and would meet me at the schoolhouse in 2 days." She stared into the fire, seeing not the flames, but Blackwood's smiling, deceitful face. There was no schoolhouse. There was no town. There was nothing but dirt and broken dreams. He never came. I was stranded, with no money and nowhere to go. Ethan listened without interruption, his gray eyes fixed on her face. The firelight flickered across his features, making it impossible to read his expression. When she finished, the silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. She expected pity, or perhaps a lecture on the foolishness of trusting a stranger. Instead, he slowly uncurled his fingers, revealing the small object in his palm. It was a roughly carved wooden horse, its surface worn smooth with time. "I had a wife," he said, his voice low and raspy, as if the words themselves were painful. "Sarah, and a son, Jacob. He was 4 years old." He stared at the wooden horse. "I carved this for him. He was never without it." He paused, and the effort it took him to continue was visible in the tightening of his jaw. "The fever came in the winter 4 years ago. It took them both in less than a week. There was nothing I could do. I was a soldier. I'd faced cannon fire, but I couldn't fight something I couldn't see." He looked up from the toy, and his eyes met hers. The coldness was gone, replaced by a raw, naked pain that mirrored her own sense of loss. "I built this place to be alone. I thought if I didn't have anything, I couldn't lose anything else." In that moment, the chasm between them vanished. He was no longer the stoic, intimidating rancher, and she was no longer the foolish, helpless woman from the East. They were just two people, bound by a shared understanding of grief, sitting together in the quiet darkness. She saw the kindness he tried so hard to conceal, the honor that had made him stop for her, the deep well of pain from which his solitude had sprung. He, in turn, saw not a delicate, wilting flower, but a woman of quiet strength, a woman who had faced betrayal and ruin and had still, somehow, found the will to walk toward a place called redemption. A mutual respect, fragile but real, began to take root in the ashes of their shared sorrow. A week later, Ethan rode into Redemption Creek for supplies. The town was little more than a single dusty street lined with a dozen false-fronted buildings, a general store, a saloon, a smithy, and a sheriff's office. It was a place that clung to existence by a thread, just like most of the people in it. As he tied Apollo to the hitching post outside the general store, he noticed two men loitering on the boardwalk. They were strangers, and they had the hard, watchful look of men who were paid to be trouble. One was tall and thin with a weasel-like face. The other was built like a bull, with a thick neck and small, mean eyes. They didn't belong here. Inside the store, as Ethan gathered sacks of flour and coffee, he overheard them talking to the proprietor, Mr. Henderson. "We're looking for a woman," the weaselly one said, his voice a low drawl. "Came in on the stage about 2 weeks back. From the East. Pretty thing, honey-colored hair. Answers to the name Clara." Ethan froze, his hand hovering over a barrel of nails. He kept his back to them, pretending to inspect a shovel handle, but his ears strained to catch every word. "Can't say I've seen anyone like that," Henderson replied, his voice carefully neutral. Townspeople in places like Redemption Creek were slow to offer information to strangers, especially ones who smelled of ill intent. "She was supposed to be working for a fella named Blackwood," the burly one added, his voice a low growl. "Might have gotten herself lost. There's a reward for information." Ethan's blood ran cold. Blackwood. The name hung in the air like poison. So, the swindler wasn't content with just taking Clara's money and leaving her to die. He had sent men to find her. Why? The only reason was to silence her. A living, breathing witness to his fraud was a liability he couldn't afford. Ethan paid for his supplies, his movements deliberate and calm, betraying none of the turmoil inside him. He gave the men a wide berth as he left, but he felt their eyes on his back, speculative and cold. Before he left town, he stopped at the sheriff's office. Sheriff Brody was a man well past his prime, with a drooping mustache and eyes that had seen the town through its worst days. He was an old friend of Ethan's father, one of the few connections to his past that Ethan still tolerated. "Ethan," Brody said, looking up from his paperwork, "don't see you in town more than twice a year. Everything all right out at your place?" "There are two men over at the general store. Strangers, asking questions about a woman from the East," Ethan said, getting straight to the point. Brody leaned back in his chair, his expression turning serious. "Saw them ride in this morning. Dressed too well for cowhands. Armed too heavy for travelers. They smell like trouble looking for a place to happen, Ethan. You know anything about this woman they're looking for?" Ethan hesitated. Admitting Clara was at his ranch would tie him to her problems. It was a complication he didn't want, but keeping it for Brody was a risk he couldn't take. "She's at my place," he said, his voice tight. "I found her out on the plains. She was near dead." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "Blackwood's doing—" Ethan nodded. "He swindled her. Left her for dead. Silas Blackwood is a snake selling dreams of paradise," Brody said with disgust. "He's wanted for similar schemes in Kansas. If he's sent men after her, it's because he wants to make sure she can't testify against him. You be careful, son. Those men are not the sort to ask nicely twice." The ride back to the ranch was fraught with a new kind of tension. The threat was no longer a vague possibility. It had a face, a name. It was riding the same dusty roads as him. When he saw the smoke curling from his chimney, a familiar sight that usually brought a sense of peace, he felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach. The ranch was no longer a fortress. It was a target. He found Clara in the small garden patch behind the house, where Martha had been trying for years to coax vegetables from the unforgiving soil. She was on her knees, carefully tending to a row of struggling tomato plants, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. She looked up and smiled as he approached, a genuine, unguarded smile that did something strange to his insides. In the weeks she had been there, a subtle transformation had occurred. The haunted, desperate look in her eyes had been replaced by a quiet determination. She had filled out, the gauntness of her face softening. She had found a purpose in the small, daily tasks of the ranch, and it suited her. She was not just surviving. She was beginning to bloom in this harsh environment. And that terrified him. He looked at her, seeing not just a woman he had rescued, but a woman who was slowly, inexorably weaving herself into the fabric of his life. He saw the way Martha's face lit up when Clara was near. He saw the small feminine touches that had begun to appear in the house. A jar of wildflowers on the table, the curtains washed and pressed, and he felt the walls of his solitude beginning to crumble. This attachment, this feeling of protectiveness that was growing inside him, was a danger. It made him vulnerable. His mood, already dark from the encounter in town, turned to ice. He had to put a stop to this. He had to reestablish the distance between them, for her protection and for his. "You need to start making plans to leave," he said, his voice flat and cold. The smile vanished from her face, replaced by a look of confusion and hurt. "Leave? What are you talking about? I have nowhere to go." "That's not my concern," he said, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. "You're strong enough to travel now. I'll give you enough money for a train ticket back east. You don't belong here." The hurt in her eyes sharpened into anger. "I don't belong here," she repeated, her voice trembling slightly. "And where, exactly, do I belong, Mr. Kane? You know my story. There is nothing for me in the East. Nothing but shame and poverty. That's not my problem," he repeated, hating himself for the words, for the pain he was inflicting. But it was necessary. He had to make her want to leave. He had to push her away before she got any closer, before the men Blackwood had sent found her here. "This ranch is not a charity. I took you in because you were dying. Now you're not. It's time for you to move on." He turned and walked away before she could see the conflict raging in his own eyes. He felt like a coward, using cruelty as a shield. But it was better for her to hate him and be safe than for her to stay here and be in danger. He spent the rest of the day in a fury of activity, repairing a section of fence on the farthest edge of his property, working until his muscles burned and his mind was numb. But he couldn't outrun the image of her face, the wounded disbelief in her eyes. The next day, the threat escalated. Ethan was checking on his small herd when he saw a rider on the ridge overlooking his northern pasture. It was the tall, weaselly man from town. He wasn't doing anything, just watching. A cold knot of fury tightened in Ethan's gut. This was a violation, a deliberate incursion. He spurred Apollo into a gallop, closing the distance in a cloud of dust. As he approached, the man casually raised his rifle and fired a shot into the air. The sound cracked through the silence, and Ethan's horses, already skittish, bolted. "Damn you!" Ethan roared. He spent the next hour rounding up the spooked animals, his anger simmering. When he finally had the herd settled, he rode straight up the ridge to confront the man, who was still there, a smirk on his thin face. "Lose something, rancher," the man drawled. "Get off my land," Ethan said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Public ridge," the man countered, patting his rifle. "Just enjoying the view. Unless you've got something to hide." Ethan's hand drifted to the butt of the pistol on his hip. He could end this right now, but that would bring the law, questions, and expose Clara completely. He had to be smarter than this. He looked the man dead in the eye, his gaze as cold and hard as granite. "This is your only warning. The next time I see you on or near my property, I will not be so courteous. I will consider it a threat to my home, and I will eliminate that threat. Am I understood?" There was no bluster in his voice, only a chilling certainty. The man's smirk faltered. He had been testing the rancher, and he had found something harder than he expected. Without another word, he turned his horse and rode away. The incident solidified Ethan's resolve. He couldn't protect her if she was here. The ranch was too isolated, the threat too close. He rode back to the house, his decision made. He found Clara on the porch, her hands clenched in her lap, her expression a mixture of defiance and despair. "Pack your things," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We ride for Cheyenne at dawn. I'm putting you on a train back east." She shot to her feet, her eyes blazing. "I will not go. You cannot make me." "I can and I will," he said, his voice hard. "I will not have you endangering my home." He was using her as the excuse, twisting the truth to serve his purpose. "I am endangering your home?" she cried, her voice breaking. "I have done nothing but try to repay your kindness, a kindness you now seem to regret. You think I am some delicate flower, Mr. Kane? You think I will shatter if the wind blows too hard? I survived the desert. I survived being cheated and abandoned. This is my life now, whether you like it or not. I will not run away. Her defiance was magnificent. It was the same spirit that had refused to die in the wilderness, the same fire he had admired from the moment he met her. And it was the very thing that was going to get her killed. The misunderstanding between them was now a chasm. She saw him as a cruel, unfeeling man trying to discard her. He saw himself as her only protector, forced to be cruel in order to save her. Neither of them could see a way across. "You'll be ready at dawn," he said, his voice like stone, and walked into the house, the door closing behind him with a sound of utter finality. That night, an unnatural stillness settled over the ranch. The wind died down, and the silence was heavy, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the frantic beating of Clara's heart. She sat on her bed, her meager belongings untouched. She would not pack. She would not be sent away like an unwanted parcel. This place, this harsh and beautiful land, had become a part of her. Ethan Kane, with his cold eyes and his buried heart, had become a part of her, too. She refused to believe the cruelty he had shown her was the real man. She had seen the other side of him, the man who grieved for his lost family, the man who had carried her to safety. She would not abandon that man, even if he had abandoned her. The moon climbed high in the sky, a silver disk in a sea of stars. From the main room, she heard the scrape of a chair, then the soft tread of Ethan's boots as he paced before the hearth. He couldn't sleep either. The thought gave her no comfort. The house was a tinderbox of unspoken emotions and imminent danger, waiting for a spark. The spark came just after midnight. It began not with a bang, but with a splintering crash. The window in the main room shattered, glass spraying across the floor. Clara gasped, jumping to her feet. A moment later, a gunshot exploded through the night, the sound deafening in the small house. "Clara, get down!" Ethan's voice was a roar, a command that cut through her fear. She dropped to the floor of her room, her heart hammering against her ribs. She heard the heavy thud of the main table being overturned, the scrape of it being dragged across the floor to form a barricade. Another shot rang out, this one punching a hole through the front door. Ethan was in his element. The years of solitude, the instincts honed in war and wilderness, took over. He moved with a swift, deadly purpose, grabbing the rifle he had been cleaning earlier. He knelt behind the makeshift barricade, the familiar weight of the weapon a cold comfort in his hands. There were 3 of them. He had seen their shadows moving in the moonlight. The weasel-faced man and the burly one from town, plus a third. They were done asking questions. They had come to finish the job. "Stay in your room. Don't make a sound," he yelled, his voice tight with adrenaline. He fired a shot through the broken window at a moving shadow, rewarded by a curse of pain from the darkness. One of them was hit. Clara crawled to her doorway, peering into the main room. She could see Ethan's silhouette against the faint glow of the dying embers in the fireplace. He was a lone defender, a bastion of strength against the encroaching violence. But he was just one man. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her, but something else rose to meet it, a fierce, primal anger. These men, Blackwood's thugs, had tried to destroy her once. They would not succeed. She would not be a helpless victim cowering in a corner while the man who saved her fought for her life. While 2 of the men kept Ethan pinned down with sporadic gunfire from the front, the third, the burly one, circled around to the back of the house. He was counting on the rancher being focused on the main assault. He reached the kitchen door and threw his shoulder against it. The wood groaned but held. He tried again, and this time the frame splintered. Inside, Martha was huddled in a corner, her hands over her ears, her eyes wide with terror. She was frozen, a statue of fear. Clara, seeing the kitchen door about to give way, scrambled to her feet. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for a weapon. They landed on the heavy, cast-iron skillet hanging by the stove. It was Martha's pride, seasoned over years of use. Without a second's hesitation, Clara grabbed it. It was heavy, unwieldy, but solid. The door burst inward with a crash of splintering wood, and the burly thug stumbled into the room, a pistol in his hand. His eyes took a moment to adjust to the dim light, and in that moment Clara acted. With a cry that was part fear and part rage, she swung the iron skillet with all the strength she possessed. The pan connected with the side of the man's head with a sickening, metallic thud. He grunted, his eyes rolling back in his head, and collapsed to the floor in a heap, stunned and senseless. The sudden silence from the back of the house was a new sound in the symphony of violence. Ethan heard it and knew something had changed. The diversion, however brief, was an opportunity. He rose from behind his barricade, moving to a side window that gave him a different angle on the yard. The weasel-faced man, confused by the sudden quiet from his accomplice, made a fatal mistake. He exposed himself for a second too long, tried to peer around the corner of the house. Ethan's rifle cracked once, the shot clean and true. The man crumpled to the ground and did not move. One left. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the gunfire. Where is he? Ethan strained his ears, listening. He heard a faint scrape from the direction of the woodpile near the side of the house. The last man was trying to get a clear shot through the side window. Ethan moved silently, his back pressed against the wall, his rifle ready. Suddenly, the remaining thug burst through the shattered front window, diving into the room in a shower of glass. He had gambled that a direct assault was his only chance. He was fast. He rolled and came up firing, his pistol barking. The shot went wide, but forced Ethan to drop back. The man was on him in an instant, kicking the rifle from his grasp. The two men crashed to the floor, locked in a desperate, brutal struggle. The thug was strong, his hands like vices as they closed around Ethan's throat. Black spots danced in Ethan's vision. He clawed at the man's wrists, but his grip was unyielding. Just as his strength began to fail, a figure appeared in the doorway of the kitchen. It was Clara. In her hands, she held Ethan's heavy hunting rifle, the one he kept mounted over the fireplace. Her face was pale as a ghost in the moonlight, her arms trembling under the weapon's weight, but her eyes were filled with a terrifying, steady resolve. She didn't know how to fire it, but the man strangling Ethan didn't know that. "Get away from him," she said, her voice shaking but clear. The thug's eyes flickered toward her, his focus broken for a single, crucial second. It was all Ethan needed. With a final, desperate surge of strength, he bucked his hips, throwing the man off balance. He twisted, breaking the hold on his throat, and drove his fist into the man's jaw. The fight was over. Silence descended, absolute and profound. The only sounds were the ragged gasps of their breathing and the mournful whisper of the wind through the broken window. The air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and fear. Ethan pushed himself to his feet, his body aching, his throat raw. He looked at the carnage, at the unconscious man in the kitchen and the one on his floor. Then he looked at Clara. She was still standing there, holding the heavy rifle, the very picture of fierce, trembling strength. He saw the iron skillet on the floor by the fallen thug. He saw the defiant fire in her eyes. He saw not the delicate woman from Boston he had tried to push away, but a warrior, a survivor who had stood her ground and fought beside him. The adrenaline drained out of him, and in its place came a wave of emotion so powerful it threatened to bring him to his knees. It was terror, relief, and a fierce, overwhelming love. He stumbled toward her, his legs unsteady. He reached her and pulled her into his arms, crushing her against him. The rifle fell to the floor with a clatter. He buried his face in her hair, breathing in her scent, assuring himself that she was real, that she was alive. "I thought I'd lost you," he rasped, his voice breaking, the words torn from the deepest, most guarded part of his soul. "When I heard the glass break, I thought, I can't lose you, Clara. I can't." He pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands framing her face. The mask was gone. The stoicism, the coldness, all of it had been burned away in the heat of the battle. His gray eyes were shining with unshed tears. "I was a fool," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "A life alone isn't living. It's just waiting to die. I was so afraid of losing someone again that I almost lost the one person who could teach me how to live. I love you, Clara. The confession hung in the ruined room, more powerful than any gunshot. It was a surrender and a declaration, an end to his long war with himself. He had tried to build a fortress of solitude, but she had breached its walls not with force, but with her quiet courage and unwavering heart. In the wreckage of his home, amidst the chaos and violence, he had finally found his own redemption. The sound of approaching horses, a muffled thunder in the night, announced the arrival of Sheriff Brody and a small posse. The sustained gunfire had echoed for miles across the still valley, a clear signal that something was terribly wrong at the Kane Ranch. Brody took one look at the scene, the bodies, the shattered windows, Ethan and Clara clinging to each other, and his weary face hardened. "Ethan, are you all right?" "Ma'am?" he asked, his eyes full of concern. "We're fine, Brody," Ethan said, his arms still wrapped securely around Clara's waist, as if he were afraid she might vanish if he let go. Thanks to her, the sheriff and his deputies took the surviving thugs into custody. The one Clara had hit with the skillet was groggy but alive. The other, whom Ethan had subdued, was sullen and silent. Under Brody's practiced interrogation back in town, the second man's resolve would quickly crumble. He would confess everything, detailing Silas Blackwood's entire fraudulent land scheme and his orders to silence the woman from Boston who could expose him. Warrants would be issued. The law would eventually catch up to Blackwood. The external threat, the dark cloud that had followed Clara across the country, was finally beginning to dissipate. After the posse departed, taking the violence and the dead with them, an extraordinary peace settled over the ranch. The rising sun cast a pale, rosy light over the landscape, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the shafts of light that pierced the broken windows. The destruction was stark in the morning glow, but it no longer felt like a violation. It felt like a purging. Ethan gently led Clara to a chair that was still upright. He knelt before her, taking her hand. He noticed a long, shallow scratch on her forearm, already beginning to bruise. "You're hurt," he said softly. He went to the kitchen and returned with a basin of water and a clean cloth. With a tenderness that belied his calloused hands, he carefully cleaned the wound. The simple, domestic act was more intimate than anything that had passed between them. It was an act of caring, of devotion. He didn't release her hand when he was finished. He just held it, his thumb stroking the back of her palm. The silence in the room was no longer heavy or awkward. It was filled with everything that had been said and everything that was still to come. "Clara," he began, his voice low and serious, the sound resonating in the quiet room. He looked around at the wreckage of his home, the physical manifestation of the life he had tried to build, now shattered, and he felt no regret. "This place, I built it to be empty, but you filled it. You filled it with life, with courage, with hope." He released her hand and moved to the great stone hearth. He knelt and pried loose a stone near the base, one that had always been slightly uneven. From a small cavity behind it, he retrieved a small, worn wooden box. He brought it back to her and opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a simple, unadorned gold band. "This was my grandmother's," he said, his voice thick with reverence. "She came west with my grandfather, crossed the plains in a wagon. She was a strong woman. Like you, she gave this ring to my mother, and my mother gave it to me. It was meant for Sarah." He paused, the memory of his first wife a sad, gentle shadow, not a haunting ghost. But a life isn't about what was meant to be. It's about what is. It's about the chances you take, the person you become. And you're my life now, Clara. You're my home. He took the ring from a box and looked in her eyes, his own shining with a fierce, unwavering love. "Marry me, Clara. Build a new life with me. Right here. Not on the ashes of the old one, but on a new foundation. Our foundation." Tears streamed down Clara's face, but they were tears of overwhelming joy, of relief, of finding a safe harbor after a long and brutal storm. She had come west seeking a small piece of land to call her own, and instead, she had found a whole world in the heart of this solitary man. "Yes," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Oh, yes, Ethan. Yes." He slipped a ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. He leaned in and kissed her, not with the desperate urgency of the night before, but with a deep, profound tenderness, a kiss that sealed a promise and began a future. News of the attack and of Ethan and Clara's engagement traveled through Redemption Creek with the speed of a prairie fire. Martha, who had been a silent observer of their burgeoning love, became its most vocal champion. The story of the refined Eastern lady who had faced down a hardened criminal with nothing but a skillet became the stuff of local legend. The townspeople, who had once been wary and gossipy, now saw Ethan and Clara in a new light. They were not just a reclusive rancher and a stranded woman. They were two of their own who had fought for their home and found love in the process. The community responded in the way frontier communities always did, with action. A few days after the attack, a procession of wagons rumbled up the lane to the Kane Ranch. Men from town and neighboring homesteads arrived with lumber, tools, and panes of glass. The women came with baskets of food, bolts of cloth, and endless chatter. They descended on the damaged house in a flurry of organized chaos, a spontaneous barn-raising to repair not just the physical structure, but the sense of security that had been shattered. Ethan, who had spent years holding the world at arm's length, found himself surrounded by neighbors offering help, slapping him on the back, and congratulating him. He was awkward at first, and used to the easy camaraderie, but as he worked alongside them, nailing new timbers into place, he felt a sense of belonging he hadn't realized he was missing. He saw Clara laughing as she helped the women lay out a feast on a makeshift table, and his heart swelled. He was no longer an island. He was part of a community, part of family. They were rebuilding his house, and in doing so, they were welcoming him back into the world. Epilogue. 2 years later. The late afternoon sun cast a warm, golden glow across the valley. The Kane Ranch was no longer a stark outpost against the wilderness. It was a thriving homestead. The house had been repaired and expanded with a wide, covered porch that ran the length of the front. A garden, vibrant with flowers and vegetables, flourished where Clara had first knelt in the dirt, a testament to her patient care. The herd of cattle had grown, and the fences, once symbols of isolation, now simply marked the boundaries of a prosperous and happy home. Clara sat in a rocking chair on the porch, a book open in her lap. She was not reading. Her attention was on a small boy, not quite 2 years old, who was toddling on unsteady legs across the wooden planks. He had his father's dark, wavy hair and his mother's determined chin. He clutched a small, worn wooden horse in one hand, a familiar toy that had been passed from one generation to the next. Clara's other hand rested protectively on the gentle swell of her belly, where their second child was growing. A rider appeared on the horizon, a familiar silhouette against the setting sun. Clara's heart gave a familiar, happy leap. It was Ethan, returning from a day spent checking on the herd in the high pastures. As he drew closer, she could see the easy way he sat in the saddle, the relaxed confidence of a man at peace with himself and his world. The grim, haunted lines that had once seemed carved into his face were gone, smoothed away by years of laughter and love. He dismounted, and their son, Samuel, let out a squeal of delight, running toward him with outstretched arms. "Papa!" Ethan smiled, a real, easy smile that reached his pale gray eyes and made them shine. He swung the boy into his arms, settling him on his hip. He walked onto the porch and leaned down, giving Clara a long, lingering kiss that tasted of sunshine and contentment. "Everything quiet here?" he asked, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "Perfectly quiet," she answered, her hand covering his as it rested on her shoulder. He stood beside her, his son nestled in one arm, his other hand now resting beside hers on the curve of her stomach. Together, they watched the sun dip below the jagged peaks of the Bighorns, painting the sky in breathtaking strokes of orange, pink, and purple. The Fortress of Solitude was a distant memory, replaced by a sanctuary of love and family. Everything I ever needed, he said softly, his gaze moving from the majestic landscape to his wife and child. It was right here all along. I was just too blind to see it until you taught me how. Clara turned her head, her cheek resting against his hand. She looked at this strong, good man who had saved her in more ways than one, and at the beautiful life they had built together from the dust and wreckage of their pasts. "We found our way home, Ethan," she whispered. "Together." The last rays of sunlight bathed them in gold, and the wind, once a lonely, merciless companion, now whispered through the cottonwoods like a gentle lullaby, a promise of all the peaceful nights to come.